Marcus Hayes, a retired soldier, finds a new purpose running a community center in a neighborhood overshadowed by crime and despair. But one rainy night, everything changes when he stops a desperate young man named Kyle from committing a robbery. Kyle is trapped in a life of crime under the influence of his older brother, Caleb, a dangerous man who won't let go easily. Determined to help Kyle turn his life around, Marcus soon faces a difficult challenge: saving one brother without losing the other. As tensions rise, the three of them are pushed to their limits. Choices must be made, and the path to redemption is never easy. Can Marcus's belief in second chances pull Kyle out of Caleb's shadow, or will their past mistakes drag them back down? Hit subscribe to follow this powerful story of hope, struggle, and transformation, and let us know in the comments if you believe in the power of second chances. The early morning light crept through the sheer curtains of Marcus Hayes's small, neatly kept house. The sun was rising over the quiet neighborhood, casting a soft glow across the streets that had long since been forgotten by the city planners. Marcus, now 78 years old, sat at his kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a warm cup of black coffee. His eyes followed the sunlight as it poured through the window, casting shadows on the old wallpaper that had seen better days. The quiet suited him. Life had settled into a routine that gave him peace, though the stillness often left his mind wandering back to a past filled with noise. Marcus had served in the military for over 30 years, first as a young recruit fresh out of high school, and eventually rising through the ranks to become a sergeant. He had seen more than his share of war. His hands, now worn and calloused, had once been the steady hands of a leader in combat. He had carried the weight of responsibility for the lives of younger men, some of whom had never made it home. His body had aged, but his mind was still sharp, and some nights the memories of distant jungles and desert battles visited him in dreams. But unlike many of his fellow veterans, Marcus had learned to live with those memories. He had made peace with the past, even if it never truly let him go. He stood up slowly, his back stiff from sitting too long, and placed the empty cup in the sink. The kitchen was simple, much like the rest of his house, neatly kept, but minimal. There were a few signs of his former life: framed photographs of his unit, medals carefully mounted in a small display case on the wall. But Marcus didn't dwell on those days. He preferred to look forward, to focus on what could still be done in the time he had left. After washing the cup, Marcus grabbed his jacket from the back of the kitchen chair and stepped outside. The neighborhood was quiet this early, just the way he liked it. The streets were mostly empty, a few cars parked along the curb, some houses were still dark as their occupants slept. As he walked, Marcus passed the old brick houses that lined his block. The neighborhood wasn't what it used to be. In the years since Marcus had returned from service, he had watched as businesses closed down, families moved away, and crime slowly crept into the corners. The once bustling streets were now cracked and littered with trash, the windows of old shops boarded up. But Marcus stayed. This place was home, and despite the changes, he still believed in its potential. As he walked, Marcus's mind wandered to the community center, where he spent most of his time. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, a small, weather-beaten building tucked between an empty lot and a closed-down diner. But to Marcus, it was more than just a place to pass the time. The center had become a refuge for many of the neighborhood's kids, a place where they could get off the streets and into something positive. It wasn't easy, and the challenges were plenty. But Marcus had always believed that even the smallest acts of kindness could make a difference. The sound of basketballs bouncing echoed through the worn-out gymnasium as Marcus entered the community center. He paused for a moment in the doorway, taking in the familiar scene. A group of teenagers, boys mostly, were playing a pickup game on the cracked court. The lights overhead flickered slightly, a reminder that the center was always in need of repairs, but Marcus had learned to accept the imperfections. What mattered most were the kids who came through the doors. As he walked toward the back of the gym, he was greeted by Martha Daniels. the center's director and Marcus's longtime friend. Martha was a warm, motherly figure who had been running the center for over a decade. Her graying hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her face, lined with years of worry and hard work, broke into a smile as she saw Marcus approaching. "Well, if it isn't my favorite sergeant," Martha said, wiping her hands on a towel. "You're in early today." Marcus smiled back. "Couldn't sleep much, thought I'd get a head start." Martha chuckled softly. "I figured. How's the neighborhood treating you? Still the same?" "Still the same," Marcus replied, glancing toward the boys on the court. "But I'm hoping to change that." Martha nodded, her smile fading slightly. She knew how much Marcus cared about the neighborhood, about the kids who came through the center. Over the years, they had seen too many of them fall into bad situations, caught up in gangs, drugs, and violence. But Marcus never gave up on any of them, no matter how far they seemed to have fallen. "Any troublemakers today?" Marcus asked, his voice light but serious. Martha sighed. "You know how it is. Tommy's been doing better. He's been coming in regularly, working on his GED. But there's always one or two who need extra attention." Marcus followed her gaze to the far corner of the gym, where a young man was sitting by himself, head down, earphones in. Kyle Dawson. He was one of the newer faces at the center, a 20-year-old with a reputation for being difficult. He came from a broken home, and his older brother Caleb had already been in and out of jail several times. Marcus had noticed Kyle a few months ago, hanging around with the wrong crowd, and had made it his mission to try to reach him. "Has he talked to you at all?" Marcus asked, nodding toward Kyle. Martha shook her head. "Not much. He keeps to himself. But he's been showing up more often, so I take that as a good sign." Marcus knew better than to expect quick results. With kids like Kyle, it took time. Trust didn't come easily, especially when life had dealt them the hand it had dealt Kyle. But Marcus was patient. He had learned that in the military, how to wait, how to watch, and how to act when the moment was right. He walked over to Kyle, pulling up a chair beside him. The young man didn't look up, his eyes fixed on the phone in his hands, music blaring through his earphones. "How's it going, Kyle?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. Kyle didn't respond at first, but Marcus wasn't deterred. He sat there quietly for a moment before speaking again. "I know you've got a lot on your plate, but I want you to know, if you ever need to talk, I'm here." Kyle shifted uncomfortably, pulling out one of his earphones. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Marcus said calmly, "that I've seen a lot of young men like you. And I know it's not easy, but you don't have to go through it alone." Kyle rolled his eyes, his expression hardening. "I don't need your help." Marcus didn't react to the hostility. He had been in enough tough situations to know when someone was putting up walls. "That's fine," he said simply. "But if you change your mind, you know where to find me." Kyle didn't respond, but Marcus wasn't discouraged. He stood up and gave the young man a small nod before heading back to the other side of the gym. Martha was waiting for him, her arms crossed. "He's a tough one." "They all are," Marcus replied. "But I've seen tougher." Martha smiled. "That's what I like about you, Marcus. You never give up on anyone." Marcus didn't say anything, but he knew Martha was right. He had seen too many young men thrown away by society, written off as lost causes. He had made it his mission to make sure that didn't happen, not while he still had the strength to do something about it. The sun had set by the time Marcus left the community center. The streets were quieter now, the shadows longer as the streetlights flickered to life. The cool evening air felt refreshing after the long day, and Marcus pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders as he walked down the sidewalk. He made his way toward the ATM a few blocks away, his usual stop before heading home. He didn't carry much cash, but he liked to keep a little on hand for the kids at the center in case they needed lunch money or a bus fare. It was a small gesture, but it made a difference. As Marcus approached the ATM, The stillness of the night settled over him. The quiet was calming, and for a moment he let himself relax. His mind drifted to the day's events, the faces of the kids he had spoken to, and the weight of their struggles. He had seen so much in his life, more than most, and he had learned that sometimes all a person needed was someone to believe in them. As he inserted his card into the machine, Marcus's instincts suddenly flared to life. He caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of the ATM screen, a shadow shifting behind him. His years of military training kicked in, and his body tensed, but he didn't turn around right away. Instead, he kept his eyes on the screen, watching the reflection carefully. The figure behind him was getting closer, moving with purpose. Marcus's mind raced, assessing the situation. He wasn't armed, but that didn't mean he was defenseless. He had been in worse situations than this, and he knew how to handle himself. "Hey, old man." The voice was young, but it was laced with a forced bravado that made Marcus's senses sharpen. He turned slowly, coming face to face with the person who had been following him. A young man in his early 20s, his hoodie pulled up over his head, his hand hidden in his pocket. Marcus's eyes immediately locked onto the boy's stance. Nervous, tense, but not yet committed to action. The young man stepped closer, and Marcus saw the glint of a knife in his hand as he pulled it from his pocket. "Hand over your wallet," the young man said, his voice steady, but his eyes flickering with uncertainty. Marcus remained calm, his years of discipline and training taking over. He looked the boy over, noting his disheveled appearance, the desperation in his eyes. This wasn't a seasoned criminal. This was someone in trouble, someone scared. "Take it easy, son," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to do this." The boy's hand tightened on the knife, his eyes narrowing. "Just give me the wallet. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Marcus didn't flinch. He had seen fear like this before, seen it in the eyes of soldiers about to go into battle, seen it in the faces of young men who thought they had no other choice. This boy, whoever he was at a crossroads, and Marcus knew that how he handled this moment could make all the difference. "I've been where you are," Marcus said softly, "and I know you don't want to do this." The boy blinked, his grip on the knife wavering for just a moment, but then his face hardened again. "You don't know anything about me." Marcus stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on the boy's. "I know enough to see that you're scared. I know enough to see that you don't want to hurt anyone." The boy hesitated, his hand shaking now. He looked down at the knife in his hand, then back at Marcus. "I don't have a choice," he whispered. "There's always a choice," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "You can walk away from this right now. You don't have to do this." For a long moment, the boy didn't move. His chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, his mind clearly racing. Marcus could see the conflict in his eyes, the battle between fear and reason. The boy wasn't a killer, he was just lost. Then, slowly, the boy lowered the knife. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out, not for the knife, but for the boy's shoulder. "You're going to be okay," Marcus said quietly. "Let's talk." The boy's shoulders sagged, the weight of his decision crashing down on him. He nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and shame. Marcus took the knife from his hand and tucked it into his pocket, then guided the boy to sit on the curb beside him. "What's your name?" Marcus asked gently. "Kyle," the boy mumbled. Marcus's eyes widened slightly, recognizing the name. Kyle Dawson, the same boy who had been coming to the center, the one he had been trying to reach for weeks. "I know you, Kyle," Marcus said softly. "You've been coming to the community center." Kyle's head dropped, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to do this." "I know," Marcus replied. "But you don't have to do it anymore. You can change this, Kyle. You can turn things around." Kyle looked up, his eyes searching Marcus's face for something, understanding, forgiveness, hope. Marcus met his gaze with steady, unwavering resolve. "You're not alone in this," Marcus said. "We'll figure it out together." The silence between Marcus and Kyle stretched as they sat on the curb, the cool night air heavy with unsaid words. The young man beside Marcus was still trembling slightly, the weight of the knife gone from his hand, but the burden of what he had almost done remained. Marcus studied Kyle's face, etched with exhaustion, guilt, and something deeper, a desperate fear, the kind that lingered in the eyes of someone running from the inevitable. Before Marcus could say more, the low growl of an engine disrupted the fragile peace. Headlights cut through the shadows as a black sedan rolled down the street, its slow, menacing approach stirring a deep unease in Marcus's gut. Kyle's body stiffened beside him, his earlier remorse giving way to dread. "That's him," Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible. He turned his head to Marcus, his eyes wide with panic. "It's Caleb." Marcus straightened, his years of military discipline kicking in. He watched as the car pulled up a few feet away, its sleek, tinted windows hiding the driver. The back window rolled down just enough to reveal a man sitting in the shadows. He was older than Kyle, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, with a chiseled jaw and sharp eyes that gleamed with cold, predatory focus. Caleb Dawson. Marcus had heard about Caleb from Martha and the other kids at the center. Stories about his reputation on the streets, how he'd been in and out of prison, how he had taken Kyle under his wing and dragged him into the same dangerous life. Caleb's name was whispered in fear, a name that carried the weight of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. "Kyle." Caleb's voice was low, dripping with menace. "Get in the car." Kyle's breath hitched, and he glanced at Marcus as though searching for an escape, a way out that didn't involve stepping back into his brother's world. But Marcus knew that look all too well, the look of someone torn between two impossible choices. "You don't have to go," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't the way." But Kyle didn't move, frozen in the crosshairs of Caleb's piercing gaze. Caleb's lips curled into a mocking smile, as if daring Kyle to defy him. He leaned forward slightly, his voice laced with venom. "Kyle, I'm not asking." The unspoken threat lingered in the air, and Marcus could see Kyle's resolve cracking, breaking under the weight of his brother's control. Before Marcus could say anything more, Kyle stood, his body tense with fear, and walked toward the car. "Kyle," Marcus said, his voice calm but commanding, "you don't have to do this." Kyle hesitated, his shoulders hunched, but after a brief pause, he climbed into the passenger seat without another word. The door slammed shut, and the car sped off into the night, leaving Marcus standing alone in the dim glow of the streetlight, the engine's roar fading into the distance. Marcus's jaw tightened as he watched the car disappear. He had been close, so close to reaching Kyle. But now Caleb had swept in, reminding his younger brother where he belonged. It wasn't just about the streets, it was about loyalty, the kind that bound men in blood and fear. But Marcus wasn't giving up. The next morning, Marcus walked into the community center feeling the weight of the previous night's events hanging over him. The familiar sound of basketballs thudding against the gym floor and the laughter of the kids did little to ease the knot in his chest. Kyle had been right there, ready to walk away from his brother's shadow, and in an instant, Caleb had pulled him back into it. Martha spotted Marcus as he entered the center, her sharp eyes immediately sensing something was wrong. She set down the stack of papers she'd been sorting through and walked over to him. "Rough night?" she asked, her tone soft but probing. Marcus nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Kyle's in trouble. Caleb showed up last night." Martha's face fell. "Oh no. What happened?" Marcus recounted the events at the ATM, the knife, the confrontation, and how Caleb had arrived just in time to reclaim his brother. As he spoke, Martha's expression grew more concerned. "Caleb's a dangerous man, Marcus," she said quietly. "I've heard stories. He's not someone you want to cross." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice firm but controlled. "But I don't care about Caleb. I care about Kyle. He's trapped, Martha. He thinks he owes Caleb something for looking after him all these years, but all Caleb's doing is dragging him down." Martha sighed, her hand resting gently on Marcus's arm. "You can't save everyone, Marcus." "I know that," he said softly, looking down at his worn shoes. "But I'm not giving up on him, not yet." Martha didn't say anything for a moment, but her eyes softened. She knew Marcus too well, knew that once he set his mind on something, he wouldn't let it go. It was that same quiet determination that had made him a respected leader in the military, and now a mentor to the lost kids in the neighborhood. But it was also the thing that weighed on him most heavily, the burden of always feeling responsible for others. "I just don't want to see you get hurt," Martha said finally. "I've been through worse," Marcus replied with a small smile. "But I appreciate it." Martha gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder before returning to her work, leaving Marcus standing there in the middle of the gym, watching the kids play. He had seen it too many times before. Young men like Kyle, trapped in cycles of violence, unable to break free because they didn't believe they deserved anything better. Marcus wasn't ready to let that happen to Kyle. Later that evening, Kyle sat in the cramped living room of the house he shared with Caleb. The air inside felt thick, stifling, and Kyle could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him. Caleb was in the other room, talking in law, hurried whispers on the phone. Business. No doubt the kind of business Kyle wanted no part of anymore. He stared at the old, beat-up couch beneath him, his thoughts racing in circles. Last night had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Marcus's words still echoed in his mind. "You don't have to do this. There's always a choice." But that wasn't true, was it? Not for him. Kyle had been following Caleb's lead for as long as he could remember. Their father had died when Kyle was just a kid, and Caleb had stepped in, taking care of him, shielding him from the worst of their broken world. Kyle had idolized Caleb for years, believing that his brother was all he needed. But now, he wasn't so sure. He thought back to the moment at the ATM, the look in Marcus's eyes when he had spoken to him, calm, steady, like Marcus believed in him. No one had ever looked at Kyle that way before, not even Caleb. Caleb had always expected Kyle to fall in line, to do what needed to be done to survive. But Marcus was different. He didn't demand anything from Kyle. He had simply offered a choice. Kyle's hands clenched into fists as the internal struggle raged on. How could he walk away from Caleb after everything his brother had done for him? But how could he stay, knowing that this wasn't the future he wanted? The door to Caleb's room creaked open, and Kyle quickly straightened, trying to clear his mind. Caleb stepped out, his expression sharp, his phone still in hand. "We've got a job tonight," Caleb said, his voice low but commanding. "Pawn shop down on Fulton Street. Easy money." Kyle's stomach twisted. "Caleb, don't start." Caleb interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "This is what we do, Kyle. This is how we survive. You're with me or you're not. And if you're not..." Caleb didn't need to finish the sentence. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Kyle felt his heart pound against his chest as Caleb's words echoed in his mind. "I'm not asking," Caleb said quietly, his gaze boring into Kyle's. "Be ready in an hour." Kyle didn't move as Caleb walked out of the room. The front door slammed shut behind him, and Kyle was left sitting in the oppressive silence once again. "You're with me or you're not." Kyle buried his face in his hands, his breath shaky. He had thought about running, about going back to the community center, asking Marcus for help, but he knew Caleb would come after him. Caleb always knew how to find him. The streets weren't just home, they were a prison, and Caleb was the warden. But Marcus had said there was a way out, a way to choose something different. Kyle didn't know if he believed that yet, but the idea was enough to spark something inside him. A flicker of hope. Faint, but persistent. Before he could change his mind, Kyle stood up, grabbed his hoodie from the back of the couch, and headed for the door. He wasn't sure where he was going yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't stay here. Not tonight. The phone rang at precisely 9:15 p.m., the sharp sound cutting through the stillness of Marcus's small living room. He had been sitting in his armchair, reading the same page of his book for the third time. His mind was too distracted to focus. When the phone rang, he set the book down and reached for it. "Marcus Hayes," he answered, his voice steady. There was a pause on the other end, and then a familiar voice broke through the silence. "Marcus, it's Kyle." Marcus straightened in his chair. "Kyle, what's going on?" "I need to talk to you," Kyle said, his voice rushed, filled with urgency. "It's about Caleb. He's planning something. Tonight, a job, I think. No, I know it's going to go bad." Marcus's chest tightened. He feared this might happen. Caleb was too deep in life to care about consequences, and if Kyle was right, tonight could be the breaking point. "Where are you?" Marcus asked, already standing and grabbing his jacket. "I'm on Fulton Street near the pawn shop," Kyle replied. "I don't know what to do, Marcus. Caleb, he's not going to stop." "Stay where you are," Marcus said firmly, his mind racing through possible scenarios. "I'm on my way." Kyle didn't argue. The line went dead, and Marcus quickly pocketed his phone, his movements efficient and controlled. He had been in more than his share of high-pressure situations, but this one felt different. This one felt personal. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, Marcus's thoughts drifted back to his time in the service, to the men he had led into battle. He had always believed that there was a way to save someone, even in the darkest moments. But tonight, he knew that saving Kyle, and maybe even Caleb, would be the hardest battle he had ever fought. Kyle's heart raced as he stood alone on the darkened street corner, waiting for Marcus. The street was nearly deserted, save for the flickering neon signs of closed businesses and the occasional distant rumble of a passing car. He pulled the hood of his jacket tighter over his head, trying to shield himself from the cold, but it did little to numb the dread building in his chest. His hands trembled, not from the chill in the air, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Was he really going to betray his brother? Kyle had never felt more conflicted in his life. Caleb had been his protector for so long, the one person who had always been there when no one else cared. When their father had died, it was Caleb who had taken charge, even though he was barely old enough to care for himself. He had been the one to make sure there was food on the table, the one to keep Kyle safe from the streets. Caleb had sacrificed everything for him. But now, as Kyle stood on the precipice of making a choice that could change everything, he wondered if Caleb's protection had come at too high a cost. The robberies, the drugs, the constant fear of violence. It wasn't the life Kyle wanted anymore. He had seen what happened to men who lived like Caleb, always one step away from destruction, always looking over their shoulder. Was this the only future he had? The distant sound of approaching footsteps pulled Kyle from his thoughts, and he looked up to see Marcus walking toward him, his silhouette tall and steady under the dim streetlights. The sight of the older man filled Kyle with a strange sense of relief. Marcus had a presence that commanded attention, not with fear or threats, but with calm assurance. He was someone who had seen the worst of life and yet somehow still believed in the possibility of something better. Kyle swallowed hard as Marcus approached, his heart thudding in his chest. He had never asked anyone for help like this before, and the vulnerability of it made him feel exposed. Marcus stopped in front of him, his sharp eyes scanning the empty street, taking in the tension in the air. He could sense the gravity of the situation even before Kyle spoke. "What's going on, Kyle?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but filled with concern. Kyle shifted nervously, glancing around as if expecting Caleb to appear out of nowhere. Caleb's planning a job tonight, a pawn shop on Fulton. He paused, his voice faltering. I don't know how to stop him. Marcus's expression remained steady, though Kyle could see the flicker of tension in his eyes. Where is he now? He's meeting up with a couple of guys, getting ready to hit the place, Kyle said, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I tried to talk him out of it, but… You don't understand. Caleb doesn't listen to me. He never has. Marcus nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. What's he planning to do after the job? Kyle's throat tightened as he spoke. He said we're leaving town after. He thinks the cops are closing in, and he's right. They are. This is his way of getting one last payday before we disappear. And you don't want to go, Marcus said, his voice more a statement than a question. Kyle shook his head, his voice trembling. I don't want this life anymore, Marcus. I've spent my whole life doing what Caleb told me to do, following him down every dark road, but I can't do it anymore. I just don't know how to tell him. Marcus's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on Kyle's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. Telling him won't be easy. But you're stronger than you think, Kyle. You've already taken the first step by coming here. Kyle swallowed hard, his mind racing with fear and doubt. What if he doesn't let me go? What if he… We'll figure it out, Marcus said, cutting through the fear in Kyle's voice. But first, we need to stop him from doing something that could get both of you killed. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. The weight of Marcus's words hit him like a punch. He had been so focused on his own struggle, his own fear of escaping Caleb's control, that he hadn't considered the very real possibility that this job could end in disaster. He had seen it happen to other guys Caleb ran with. One minute they were planning a heist, the next they were in the hospital or the morgue. I don't want him to die, Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible. Marcus gave Kyle's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Neither do I. That's why we're going to stop this before it gets that far. Kyle nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. He didn't know how they were going to stop Caleb, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't facing the fight alone. The minutes ticked by as Kyle and Marcus made their way toward the pawn shop on Fulton Street. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Marcus walked with purpose, his pace steady, his mind racing as he formulated a plan. Beside him, Kyle's steps were more hesitant, his thoughts spiraling with every passing second. What are we going to do? Kyle asked, his voice strained. We can't just walk in and tell him to stop. Marcus glanced at him, his expression unreadable. No, we can't. But we can talk to him. We can give him a reason to walk away. Kyle shook his head, doubt gnawing at him. You don't know Caleb like I do. He's not going to listen. He never listens. Maybe he hasn't had anyone to listen to, Marcus replied quietly. But I'm not giving up on him. Not yet. Kyle didn't respond, though his mind raced with a million different possibilities, none of them good. What if Caleb didn't listen? What if he lashed out? What if this whole thing spiraled out of control? By the time they reached the pawn shop, Kyle's hands were shaking. The street was mostly deserted, save for a few dimly lit storefronts and a couple of parked cars. The pawn shop sat on the corner, its metal security gate halfway pulled down, the windows dark, but parked just down the street was Caleb's black sedan. Kyle recognized it immediately, and the sight of it sent a shiver down his spine. He's here, Kyle whispered, his eyes darting toward the car. What do we do? Marcus didn't answer right away. He stood there for a moment, studying the scene, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He could see movement inside the pawn shop, Caleb and his men, probably already inside, preparing to make their move. We go in, Marcus said finally. But we don't confront him right away. We talk. And if that doesn't work, we stop him by whatever means necessary. Kyle's stomach lurched at the thought, but he nodded, knowing there was no turning back now. Together they approached the front of the pawn shop. The door was slightly ajar, and Kyle could hear muffled voices from inside. Caleb's voice, rough and authoritative, barking orders to the two men with him. Marcus pushed the door open quietly, stepping inside with Kyle close behind. The pawn shop was dimly lit, the shelves filled with dusty old electronics, jewelry, and guitars. Caleb was standing near the front counter, his back turned to them while one of his men rummaged through a display case with a crowbar. The other stood near the front door, keeping watch. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice calm but firm. "Caleb." The room fell silent. Caleb turned slowly, his face hardening as his eyes landed on Marcus and Kyle standing in the doorway. His gaze flickered with confusion for a moment before it morphed into something darker. Anger, betrayal. "What the hell are you doing here?" Caleb snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Marcus didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his gaze steady. "I came to stop you from making a mistake." Caleb's lip curled into a sneer. "You think you can just walk in here and stop me? You don't know who you're dealing with, old man." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Marcus replied, his voice calm but commanding. "You're a man who thinks he has no way out, but I'm telling you, Caleb, there is a way out. You don't have to do this." Caleb's eyes flashed with fury. "You think I want to do this? Do you think I want to live like this? I don't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But you've convinced yourself that this is the only way." Kyle stood frozen behind Marcus, his heart racing as he watched the tension in his brother's face grow. Caleb was on the edge, his body coiled like a spring, ready to explode. Kyle had seen him like this before when he felt trapped, cornered. "This isn't about survival anymore, Caleb," Marcus continued. "This is about pride, about proving something to yourself. But you're not going to win this fight. Not like this." Caleb's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on Marcus. "You don't know anything about me." "I know more than you think," Marcus replied, his tone even but firm. "I've been where you are. I've seen men destroy themselves trying to prove something. To themselves, to the world. And it always ends the same way." Caleb's eyes narrowed, but Marcus didn't back down. "You have a choice, Caleb. Right now. Walk away from this. Walk away before you make a mistake you can't come back from." For a long moment, the room was silent. Caleb's breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled rage. His men watched him closely, unsure of what to do, waiting for Caleb's next move. Then, slowly, Caleb reached into his jacket. Kyle's heart jumped into his throat, and he stepped forward instinctively, panic rising in his chest. "Caleb, don't—" But before he could finish, Caleb pulled out a gun. The room seemed to freeze in place as Caleb leveled the gun at Marcus, his hand steady, his face a mask of anger. Kyle's breath caught in his throat, his entire body tense with fear. Marcus didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on Caleb's, his body calm, but ready. He had been in situations like this before, where the wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. But this wasn't a war zone. This was different. This was personal. "Put the gun down, Caleb," Marcus said, his voice firm but calm. Caleb's finger hovered over the trigger, his jaw clenched. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me what to do? I've been fighting my whole life, and where has it gotten me? Nowhere." "You're right," Marcus replied, his voice even. "You've been fighting. But this isn't the fight you need to win, Caleb. This fight ends in blood, yours or someone else's, and that's not what you want." Kyle took a shaky step forward, his voice trembling. "Caleb, please, you don't have to do this." Caleb's eyes flicked to Kyle, and for a brief moment something shifted in his expression, confusion, uncertainty. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the same hard resolve. "This is who I am, Kyle," Caleb said quietly. "This is who we are. There's no walking away from that." Kyle's heart pounded in his chest, his mind spinning. Was this it? Was this how it was going to end? But then Marcus spoke again, his voice steady, cutting through the tension in the room. No, Caleb. This isn't who you are. It's who you've convinced yourself you have to be, but you can walk away from this. You can still change your path. For a long moment, Caleb didn't move. His eyes were locked on Marcus's, his hand still gripping the gun. The air in the room was thick with tension, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Then, slowly, Caleb's grip on the gun loosened. His shoulders sagged, the anger draining from his face, replaced by exhaustion. An exhaustion that ran deeper than just this moment. Marcus stepped forward cautiously, his eyes never leaving Caleb's. It's over, Caleb. You can put the gun down. Caleb hesitated for a heartbeat longer, his hand trembling now. Then, with a shaky breath, he lowered the gun. Kyle let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his body sagging with relief. Marcus reached out and took the gun from Caleb's hand, tucking it into his jacket. It's over, Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with quiet authority. Caleb stood there for a moment, his body tense, as if he didn't know what to do next. Then, slowly, he looked at Kyle. Really looked at him, for the first time in a long time. His eyes were filled with something Kyle hadn't seen in years. Regret. I'm sorry, Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. Kyle swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. It's okay, he said, his voice shaky but sincere. It's not too late. For a moment, the weight of years of tension between the brothers hung in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. Then, Caleb stepped forward and pulled Kyle into a tight embrace, the two of them standing there, holding on as if trying to find their way back to each other. Marcus watched them quietly, his heart heavy, but hopeful. The fight was over, but the road ahead would be long and difficult. Caleb had put down the gun, but now came the real battle. The battle to rebuild, to change, to find a new way forward. As Marcus stood there, watching the two brothers cling to each other, he knew that the hardest part of his work had just begun. The night after the confrontation at the pawn shop, Marcus sat alone in his modest living room, his thoughts heavy. The quiet hum of the city outside his window was a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the air just hours before. He could still feel the weight of Caleb's gun in his hand as he had taken it from him, an object that symbolized years of pain, fear, and anger. Caleb and Kyle had both been arrested shortly after the standoff, though Marcus had made sure to speak to the officers who arrived at the scene. Officer Johnson, who knew Marcus from his years working with the community center, had been understanding, agreeing to Marcus's request that Caleb be treated with care. But the law was the law, and Caleb had crossed too many lines. Marcus leaned back in his armchair, staring at the old photograph of himself and his military unit hanging on the wall. His brothers in arms, men he had fought alongside, some of whom hadn't made it home. He had seen the same hopelessness in their eyes that he saw in Caleb's now. The battles didn't always end on the battlefield. The sound of his phone vibrating on the side table broke through his thoughts. Marcus reached for it, his heart sinking as he saw Kyle's name flash across the screen. Marcus? Kyle's voice was quiet, almost broken. I'm here, Marcus replied gently, feeling the weight of the young man's desperation through the phone. They're holding us. Caleb's going to prison, isn't he? Marcus exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. Kyle, your brother made some decisions that come with consequences. But this doesn't mean it's over for him. There's always a chance for redemption. Kyle was silent for a moment, the tension between them palpable even over the phone. He's not like me, Marcus. Caleb's too deep in. He's never going to change. Marcus paused, his voice steady but firm. That's not for you to decide, son. Caleb has his own journey to take, and so do you. I don't know what to do, Kyle admitted, his voice trembling. I don't know how to move forward. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the silence to fill the space between them. He had seen this kind of despair before the weight of guilt, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But he had also seen men rise from it stronger than they ever thought possible. We take it one day at a time, Marcus said softly. But you're not alone. I'm here. And we're going to figure this out together. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings and difficult conversations. Caleb had been charged with multiple offenses related to attempted robbery, and while Marcus had spoken with the district attorney, advocating for Caleb to receive a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation, the reality was that Caleb was going to prison. Kyle sat in the back of the courtroom, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he watched the proceedings unfold. Marcus sat beside him, a steady presence, but nothing could soften the blow of hearing Caleb's sentence handed down. 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. The gavel hit the judge's desk, and Caleb was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. As he passed by Kyle, their eyes met. 2 brothers, both shaped by the same broken world, both desperate for some kind of salvation. Caleb's face was hard, his jaw set, but his eyes betrayed him. They were filled with regret, with a kind of sorrow that Kyle had never seen in him before. After the sentencing, Marcus and Kyle stepped outside into the cold air. Kyle's face was pale, his expression blank, as if the weight of the moment hadn't fully settled on him yet. He turned to Marcus, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do I do now?" Marcus placed a hand on Kyle's shoulder, grounding him. "You move forward. Caleb's made his choices, and now he has to face the consequences. But this isn't the end for him, and it's certainly not the end for you." Kyle swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "But how do I move on without him? He's always been there. Even when he was wrong, he was still there." "You're stronger than you think, Kyle," Marcus said, his voice calm but filled with quiet intensity. "You've already proven that. Now it's time to build something new, something better. You've got a future, and it's up to you to decide what that looks like." Kyle nodded slowly, though his eyes were filled with uncertainty. "What about Caleb? What's going to happen to him in there?" Marcus exhaled, knowing the reality of prison life all too well. "He'll face challenges, but I'll do everything I can to make sure he gets the support he needs. He has to want to change, Kyle, and that's something only he can decide." Kyle was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the ground. The bond between him and Caleb ran deep, deeper than Marcus could fully understand, but he knew that this moment, as painful as it was the beginning of something new for Kyle, a chance to step out of his brother's shadow and forge his own path. Months passed, and the cold bite of winter gave way to the warmth of spring. The neighborhood was still rough, still struggling, but the community center had become a beacon of hope for many. Marcus had seen a slow but steady shift in the kids who came to the center. More faces showing up, more young men and women looking for guidance, for a way out of the cycle of violence that had gripped their lives. And then there was Kyle. In the months since Caleb's imprisonment, Kyle had transformed. He had started showing up at the center every day, first just to escape the streets, but soon he began to take on more responsibility. He helped with organizing events, worked on his GED, and even started mentoring some of the younger kids who came in with the same lost look he once had. Kyle had found purpose. He wasn't the scared, uncertain young man who had stood trembling at the ATM with a knife in his hand. He was growing into someone stronger, someone more sure of himself. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. One afternoon, Kyle found himself sitting in Marcus's office at the center, the door closed behind them. He had been quiet all morning, the usual energy he brought to his work noticeably absent. Marcus, ever perceptive, had noticed. "What's going on, Kyle?" Marcus asked, leaning back in his chair. Kyle stared at the floor for a long moment before answering, his voice heavy. "It's Caleb. I got a letter from him yesterday." Marcus nodded, waiting for Kyle to continue. "He says he's trying to stay out of trouble inside, but he doesn't think he can make it. He says the fights are getting worse, and I can tell he's scared, even though he won't say it outright." Kyle's voice cracked slightly. "He's not built for that place, Marcus." Marcus took a deep breath, the weight of the situation settling over him. Prison isn't an easy place for anyone, but Caleb's stronger than you think. He's been through a lot, and if he really wants to change, he can survive this. Kyle shook his head, his eyes filled with frustration. "I don't know if he can. I don't know if he even believes he deserves to change." Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "That's something only Caleb can figure out for himself, but you can't carry that burden for him, Kyle. You've worked too hard to move forward, to build something for yourself. Caleb has his own path to walk, and you've got to let him walk it." Kyle's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. I just want to help him." "I know you do," Marcus said quietly. "But the best way you can help Caleb is by staying strong, by showing him that it's possible to change, that it's possible to build a new life even after everything that's happened." Kyle was silent for a long time, his eyes filled with a storm of emotions. Marcus knew that Kyle's loyalty to his brother ran deep, but this was part of the journey, learning to let go of the things he couldn't control, while still holding on to the hope that things could get better. "You've come a long way, Kyle," Marcus continued. "And you've got a long way to go, but you're on the right path. Don't lose sight of that." Kyle nodded slowly, though the uncertainty in his eyes hadn't completely disappeared. But Marcus knew that this was part of the process. Healing took time. Change took time. And both Kyle and Caleb had a long road ahead of them. 6 months later, the community center was filled with a new kind of energy. Kyle had just received his GED, and the kids he had been mentoring threw him a small celebration, complete with homemade cards and a cake Martha had baked herself. Kyle stood in the middle of the gathering, a little overwhelmed by the attention, but there was a light in his eyes that Marcus hadn't seen before, something like pride. Marcus watched from the side, his arms crossed over his chest, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had seen countless transformations during his time in the military, but what he had witnessed in Kyle was different. It was deeper, more personal. After the celebration wound down, Marcus and Kyle stepped outside together. The cool evening air is a welcome change from the warm, crowded gym. They walked in silence for a while, the streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. "You did good today, Kyle," Marcus said finally, breaking the silence. "You should be proud of yourself." Kyle glanced over at Marcus, his expression thoughtful. "I never thought I'd make it this far, not without Caleb." "You've made it this far because you wanted to change," Marcus replied. "You chose to fight for something better. That takes strength." Kyle was quiet for a moment, then he spoke softly, his voice filled with a kind of hope that Marcus had rarely heard from him. "Do you think he can change too? Caleb, I mean?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "If he wants it bad enough, he can, but it's not going to be easy, and it's not something you can do for him." Kyle nodded, absorbing Marcus's words. For the first time, he seemed to truly understand what Marcus had been trying to teach him all along, that change had to come from within, and that no matter how much you cared for someone, you couldn't force them to be better. They stood there for a long time. Side by side, the city stretched out before them, filled with possibilities. And for the first time in years, Kyle felt like he could see a future. One that wasn't determined by the mistakes of his past, but by the choices he made moving forward. "I think I'm ready, Marcus," Kyle said, his voice steady. ready to make this life my own. Marcus nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. I think you are too, son. As they turned back toward the community center, Marcus knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges. But for the first time, he believed that both Kyle and Caleb might just find their way out of the darkness that had defined their lives for so long. And for Marcus, that belief was enough. The weeks that followed Kyle's GED celebration were a mixture of progress and challenges. Kyle had begun working part-time at a local grocery store, a job that provided structure and a sense of purpose, but the weight of his brother's situation was never far from his mind. Caleb's letters arrived every few weeks, each one a mix of cryptic reflections and glimpses of the hardships he faced behind bars. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the community center, Kyle sat at a desk in the small office, rereading Caleb's latest letter. The paper was crumpled, the ink smudged in places, but he held on to every word. I know I've screwed up, Kyle. You don't have to keep reminding me, but I'm trying. I stay away from the gangs in here, keep my head down, like you told me. Some days I think I might actually make it out of here without turning into the monster I feel like I am. But then other days, I don't know, man, maybe this place is all I deserve. Kyle's eyes stung as he read those words, the pain in his brother's voice cutting through him. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into his pocket, his thoughts swirling. Caleb's letters were always a tightrope walk between hope and despair, and it broke Kyle's heart to know that even behind bars, his brother couldn't fully let go of the darkness that had consumed him for so long. Marcus knocked gently on the doorframe, pulling Kyle from his thoughts. He had seen the familiar look in Kyle's eyes before, the deep worry that came from caring too much, from wanting to save someone who might not be ready to be saved. How's he doing? Marcus asked, his tone gentle. Kyle looked up, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He's surviving. He says he's staying out of trouble, but I know it's hard for him. Marcus nodded, stepping into the room and sitting across from Kyle. It's never easy, especially when you're facing yourself every day. But he's lucky to have you looking out for him. That means more than you think. Kyle's shoulders slumped and he ran a hand through his hair. I just wish I could do more. I wish I could be there for him. You are there for him, Marcus said firmly. Every letter you send, every word of encouragement, it makes a difference. But you can't carry his burdens for him, Kyle. Caleb's got to find his own way. Kyle swallowed hard, blinking back the sting of unshed tears. He knew Marcus was right, but it didn't make it any easier. He had always looked up to Caleb even when his brother had led him down the wrong path. Now, he wanted to believe that Caleb could change, that there was still a future where they could both be free, not just from prison, but from the ghosts that haunted their past. Marcus placed a hand on Kyle's shoulder, his touch grounding. You've made a lot of progress, Kyle. Don't lose sight of that. You're building a life you can be proud of. And that's something Caleb needs to see, something he needs to know is possible. Kyle nodded, though the ache in his chest remained. Yeah, I just hope it's enough. Marcus didn't reply right away, but his expression softened. He knew that the road to redemption was never a straight line, and that hope could be a fragile thing. But he also believed in the strength of the human spirit, in the power of second chances. And he wasn't about to give up on Caleb or Kyle now. Months later, in the cold grip of early winter, Marcus received a surprise visitor at the community center. It was Officer Johnson, the same officer who had helped handle Caleb's arrest. He walked in with a clipboard tucked under his arm, his face serious but tinged with something that Marcus couldn't quite place. Sergeant Hayes, Johnson said with a nod, slipping into his old habit of addressing Marcus by his military title. Got a minute? Marcus gestured toward the small office in the back, and the two men sat down across from each other. Johnson pulled out a sheet of paper from his clipboard and slid it across the desk to Marcus. It was a report, an update on Caleb's time in prison. "Thought you might want to see this," Johnson said, his voice low. "It's about Caleb Dawson." Marcus scanned the document, his brow furrowing as he read. The report detailed Caleb's behavior over the past few months, his efforts to stay out of trouble, his participation in a mentorship program for younger inmates, and a note from the prison chaplain about Caleb's attempts to better himself. It was far from perfect, but it was progress. "Looks like he's trying," Marcus said, glancing up at Johnson. The officer nodded. "Yeah, it's not easy in there, but he's making an effort. Enough that the warden's considering a transfer to a lower security facility, something that might give him a shot at early parole if he keeps on this path." Marcus let out a slow breath, the weight of the news settling over him. He knew that a transfer like this could be a lifeline for Caleb, an opportunity to turn things around, to find a way out of the cycle that had defined his life for so long. But he also knew that change like this didn't happen overnight. It would take everything Caleb had to stay on this new path. "Does Kyle know?" Marcus asked, setting the report down. Johnson shook his head. "Not yet. Figured I'd leave that to you." Marcus nodded, understanding the gravity of the task. He had seen the toll Caleb's imprisonment had taken on Kyle, and he knew that sharing this news would be a moment that could either lift the young man's spirits or deepen his anxiety. That evening, Marcus called Kyle into the office, handing him the report with a gentle smile. Kyle's hands shook as he read it, his eyes widening as he took in the details. He's actually doing it?" Kyle's voice trembled with a mix of disbelief and hope. "He's really trying to change?" "It looks like it," Marcus replied, his tone steady. "But it's up to him to keep on that path, and it's up to you to keep believing in him." Kyle nodded, his eyes filling with a new determination. For the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward for both of them. With the news of Caleb's potential transfer, Kyle threw himself even more into his work at the community center. He took on new responsibilities, organizing study groups for kids working on their GEDs and helping Martha with outreach efforts to bring in more at-risk youth. The center had become a second home to him, a place where he could pour his energy into something meaningful. One afternoon, Marcus found Kyle in the gym, leading a small group of kids through a tutoring session. He watched from the doorway for a moment, a smile playing on his lips as he saw how far Kyle had come. The young man who had once been lost and angry was now a leader, guiding others down the path he had walked himself. After the session ended, Marcus approached Kyle, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You've got a knack for this, you know." Kyle shrugged, though he couldn't hide the pride in his smile. "I just try to be the person I needed when I was their age. I want them to know they can do better than what's expected of them." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly what they need. You're giving them something to believe in, Kyle. And that's no small thing." Kyle looked down at the floor, his smile fading slightly. "Do you think Caleb will be proud of me, when he gets out, I mean?" Marcus paused, his hand still resting on Kyle's shoulder. "I think he already is, but more than that, I think you've become someone you can be proud of too." Kyle met Marcus's gaze, and for the first time he felt the weight of his own worth, the sense that he had finally become more than just Caleb's little brother. He was his own person, someone who could make a difference. As the two of them stood in the quiet gym, surrounded by the echoes of the kids' laughter, Kyle realized that he had found something he never thought possible, a sense of purpose, a reason to keep fighting for the life he wanted. And as long as he kept moving forward, he knew he could face whatever came next. The day of Caleb's transfer came in the middle of a blistering summer. Marcus and Kyle stood outside the community center, the sun beating down on their faces as they waited. It had been nearly a year since Caleb's arrest, and in that time, so much had changed. The streets were still rough, but there was a renewed sense of hope, one that Marcus had fought hard to nurture. As a white prison transport van pulled up to the curb, Kyle's breath hitched, his hands clenching at his sides. The doors swung open and Caleb stepped out, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face thinner, more worn than Kyle remembered. But there was a look in his eyes. Something different, something that made Kyle's chest tighten with a mix of hope and fear. Caleb's eyes scanned the street until they landed on his brother and Marcus. He hesitated, as if unsure whether he belonged in this new world Kyle had built for himself. But then, slowly, he took a step forward. Marcus met him halfway, his expression calm but firm. "Good to see you, Caleb." Caleb swallowed hard, looking between Marcus and Kyle. "I didn't think I'd ever make it this far." Kyle's voice broke as he spoke. "You did, though, and you can keep going." Caleb's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and he nodded, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his composure. "I'm going to try, Kyle. I'm really going to try." Marcus placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, grounding him in the moment. "We're here to help you, but you've got to want it for yourself, Caleb. It won't be easy, but nothing worth having ever is." Caleb took a shaky breath, his eyes flicking between his brother and Marcus. For the first time, he felt like maybe he wasn't as alone as he had always believed. Maybe with their help, he could find a way to move forward. "I'll do my best," Caleb said quietly. "That's all we can ask for," Marcus replied. As they walked back toward the community center together, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just for Caleb, but for Kyle and for himself. They had all come so far, fought so hard to make it to this moment. And though the journey was far from over, they had found something that had once seemed impossible: hope. The late afternoon sun bathed the community center in a warm, golden light, casting long shadows across the gym floor. Marcus stood by the open doorway, watching as a small group of kids played basketball, their laughter echoing through the space. The sound filled him with a quiet sense of peace, a reminder of all the reasons he had fought so hard for this place. It had been over a year since the night of the pawn shop, and in that time, so much had changed. The streets outside the center were still rough, but they felt different now, less heavy, less burdened by the weight of fear and anger that had once defined them. The center had become a place where hope could take root, where kids like Kyle could see a future beyond the next corner. Kyle's voice echoed through the gym as he coached a group of teenagers on the court, guiding them through drills with the same focus and intensity he had once applied to his own life. He had grown into his role as a mentor, becoming someone the younger kids looked up to. It was a transformation that Marcus had watched with pride, but it hadn't come without struggles. There were still nights when Kyle found himself staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories of the past, of the things he and Caleb had done. But each morning, he chose to get up, to keep working, to keep believing that change was possible not just for himself, but for his brother too. As Marcus stepped out onto the front steps of the center, he spotted Caleb across the street, leaning against the rusted chain-link fence of an old playground. He had been released on parole a few weeks earlier after serving just over a year in the lower security facility. He was thinner than before, his face was more lined, but there was a new light in his eyes, a cautious, fragile hope that had taken root during his time behind bars. Marcus crossed the street, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. Caleb looked up as he approached, a flicker of a smile crossing his face. "Hey, Sergeant," Caleb said, using the title out of respect, even though Marcus had long since retired from the military. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "Hey, Caleb," Marcus replied, leaning against the fence beside him. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the kids play on the other side of the street. "How's it feel being back?" Marcus asked eventually, his voice gentle. Caleb shrugged, his gaze distant. It's strange. Everything feels different, like I'm seeing it all for the first time. He hesitated, then glanced at Marcus. But it's hard, harder than I thought it would be. Marcus nodded, understanding the unspoken weight behind Caleb's words. It always is. The world doesn't just change because you do, but you've got something now you didn't have before. What's that? Caleb asked, his tone edged with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Marcus smiled, a small, knowing smile. A second chance, and the people willing to help you take it. Caleb's expression softened, and he looked down at his hands, rough and scarred from years of hard living. I don't know if I deserve that chance, Marcus. Not after everything I've done. Marcus turned, meeting Caleb's gaze with the same steady resolve that had guided him through so many battles. None of us can change the past, Caleb. But we can choose what we do with the time we have left. You've already made the first step. Now it's about what you do next. Caleb swallowed hard, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He glanced back at the community center, where Kyle was now talking to a couple of kids by the entrance. His younger brother's face was lit with a kind of quiet confidence that Caleb had never seen before, something that made his chest ache with a mix of pride and regret. He's doing good, isn't he? Caleb murmured, his voice barely audible. He's doing real good, Marcus replied. But he's doing it because he believes you can too. Don't let him down, Caleb. Don't let yourself down. Caleb nodded slowly, taking in Marcus's words. It wasn't a promise, but it was the closest thing he could offer right now. He wasn't sure what his future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going back to the life he had left behind. And maybe, just maybe, he could start to believe that he was worth more than the mistakes that had defined him. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement, Marcus placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, guiding him back toward the center. It wasn't just a building to them, it was a place where lost souls found direction, where broken lives could start to mend. Inside, the center was buzzing with life. Kids lined up for a meal in the kitchen, while Martha served soup with her usual warmth, scolding them for not eating enough vegetables. Kyle was helping one of the younger boys with his reading, his patience unwavering even when the kids struggled to sound out the words. As Marcus and Caleb stepped inside, the noise seemed to hush slightly, a few of the older kids casting wary glances in Caleb's direction. His reputation still lingered, but Marcus knew that change took time, that trust had to be earned slowly, piece by piece. Kyle glanced up from his tutoring session and met his brother's eyes. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the weight of 1,000 unspoken words hanging between them. Then, slowly, Kyle gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the road they had both traveled to get here. Caleb's lips twitched into a faint smile, and he nodded back, his eyes glistening. It wasn't forgiveness. Neither of them was ready for that yet. But it was a start. And for now, that was enough. Later that evening, as the center emptied out and the last of the kids headed home, Marcus and Kyle sat together in the quiet gym. The hum of the lights is the only sound in the room. Caleb had gone back to the halfway house where he was staying, but he had promised to return the next day to help with a new project. Marcus had planned a community garden where the empty lot next door had once been. You think he'll stick around? Kyle asked, his voice soft, filled with uncertainty. Marcus considered the question, then nodded. I think he will. But it's not going to be easy for him, or for you. There'll be setbacks, tough days. But you've both come a long way, and that means something. Kyle leaned back against the bleachers, a small, tired smile crossing his face. I guess you were right after all. It's never too late to change. Marcus chuckled softly. Never too late. As long as you're willing to do the work. Kyle nodded, the weight of those words settling in his chest. He had spent so long feeling like he was defined by his past, by the mistakes he and Caleb had made. But now, for the first time, he felt like he could see a future, one that he could shape with his own hands, one that was built on hope, not fear. As they sat together, watching the last rays of sunlight filter through the high windows, Marcus felt a sense of peace settle over him. The work was far from over. There were still lives to touch, still battles to fight, but he knew that they had made a difference, that they had given hope to those who had believed it was out of reach, and in the end, that was all he had ever wanted. The next morning, the community center buzzed with activity. Volunteers arrived early, unloading bags of soil and tools for the new garden project. Marcus stood outside, directing the work, his eyes crinkling with a smile as he watched Kyle teach a group of kids how to plant seeds in the freshly turned soil. Caleb joined them a little later, a hesitant smile on his face as he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He wasn't sure if he belonged here yet, but Marcus and Kyle had made it clear that they believed he did, and maybe that was enough to keep him coming back. As the sun rose higher in the sky, bathing the neighborhood in light, Marcus took a moment to look around at the scene before him, his community, his people, and the future they were building together. He thought of the countless challenges that still lay ahead, the struggles that would inevitably come. But he also thought of the strength he had seen in Kyle, in Caleb, and in all the young men and women who had found a new path through the center. It was a future that was still unfolding, uncertain and filled with challenges. But it was a future worth fighting for. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, and allowed himself a rare moment of pride. He had found his true calling, not on distant battlefields, but right here, in the heart of his own community. And as the kids' laughter filled the air, mingling with the sound of shovels and hope, Marcus knew that whatever came next, he would be ready. Because for Marcus Hayes, for Kyle, and even for Caleb, the mission wasn't over. It was just the beginning. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in the power of second chances and the strength of community, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who might need a little hope today. Join us for more stories of redemption, resilience, and the heroes who walk among us. Thank you for watching.